Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Dingle, and welcome to Sacred Spaces, Memory and Reparation. This is the third session of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Margaret's Project's Black History Month series. And this evening, we have some amazing guests. Today, we have Michael Blakey and Peggy King Jorde. So let's talk a little bit about these two wonderful people. A National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies, Dr. Blakey is founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology at William & Mary. And from 1992 to 2009, he was the scientific director of the New York African Burial Ground Project. He is also a member of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Margaret's Project Advisory Board. Welcome, Dr. Blakey, to this conversation today.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Now, Ms. Peggy King Jorde of King Jorde Cultural Projects Consulting is a global authority in heritage site reclamation, repair, protection, and memorialization for the underrepresented histories and marginalized communities. She is consulting producer of A Story of Bones, the documentary that describes the work to reclaim and honor the remains of thousands of formerly enslaved Africans on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. In March, she will receive the Pillar Award for the Preservation League of New York State. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Peggy King Jorde.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks very much for having me.
Are you ready for some good conversations today?
I think so.
Good, good. All right, well, before we begin our conversation, we will share the trailer of A Story of Bones.
I'm standing on the most significant trace of the transatlantic slave trade, and there's nothing here to show that.
What we're trying to do is raise awareness about the heritage that has seemed to be forgotten. Everyone knows so much about Napoleon because they've worked so hard on telling the story.
Decades of conditioning that it's not important. And now we just look like a bunch of crazies trying to stir it up again.
9,000 lives wasted. Where's the message? Where's the lesson learned? All of this, right up the valley as the upper burial ground.
Are you kidding me? This is huge. You don't turn your back on something like this. It's immense. I'm coming here to bear witness because this history is tied to my history.
They were making money for hundreds of years off the backs of the people who were laying in that ground.
This issue is a global issue. Maybe that's why we've been struggling to deal with it on the island for so long.
The slave remains is an uncomfortable subject. Something needs to happen, but it never happens.
It's all about trying to build that connection between what lies beneath so we can see what's really going on. I feel nothing but hope. I believe in Saint Sabina.
But we still need to write the sign.
The signs will come, my boy.
All right, we have a lot to cover this session, so let's get started. I want to encourage everyone to please leave any comments that you may have in the chat feature. But for any specific questions that you would like the panel to answer, please put them in the Q&A section in Zoom. That is going to allow us to better see all the questions that come in. We can track them, make sure we're getting to them all, and they're not getting lost with all the other chatter that's going on in the chat feature. Also, start putting them in as soon as they come so that when we get to the Q&A portion of this program, we can jump right in to those questions. All right, I think we are ready to begin. So let's start with some questions. I know that you both worked together on the New York Burial Ground Project. Here is this burial ground containing an estimate of over 15,000 people of African descent found below Lower Manhattan. Can either of you give us some background on your work on this? How did you become involved in the work of preserving this sacred space? Who'd like to start? Peggy, you want to start?
I can start.
Okay.
Just because I was actually working in the city of New York, working for New York City's first African-American mayor. And the project was brought to my attention by another individual who worked for the city of New York, who shared a map of the site. It was in an environmental impact statement, which is a statement, it's just a document that is put together whenever a building is going up in the city of New York. I'm sure it happens in a lot of cities. You have to understand how a site is being used over a period of years if you're going to develop it. And the federal government was developing the site just 2 blocks north of City Hall, which is where I was working. And there's Office of Construction, capital construction projects at all the costs. To make a long story short, it ended up continuing to come in, land in my lap, and it piqued my interest. And ultimately, I ended up wearing lots of different hats, doing a lot of sort of insider city hall activism, really allowed to work on it. But through that process, one of the things that became really evident, sort of calling into question the federal government and what they were doing, something that I think is pivotal, and I really love this part of it. I knew nothing about archaeology, and if anything that I learned, archaeology was one of the most powerful, I guess, tools in terms of interpreting our history. And here was this opportunity for this to happen. And it was through that process of recognizing that the project needed to have professionals of color on a lot of different levels, but particularly in the area of archaeology, that I met Michael and heard about many of his colleagues, and through them understood the power of who gets to interpret the story. So throughout that process, when there was a federal steering committee that finally was put together after the fight by the community and some politicians, I ended up being the executive director of the federal steering committee, helping that committee pull together a master plan for Congress to consider to fund. And then subsequently, once it was funded, I went on to be hired as a consultant and to lead as an executive director of memorialization. And so I ran the design competitions for the Interpretive Center and the memorial. But through that process, worked with Michael and Dr. Cheryl Wilson, and we were 3 key compatriots in this project. And so that what people don't know is that we regularly spoke to one another because we were in various disciplines, and it was so important, the roles that we were all playing. And I'm so proud to be on this program with Michael because of that history and because of so much that I learned from the team of archaeologists that ultimately came. I'm going to kick it to you, Michael, because I have shorter. Otherwise, I know that weekends and outs and everything that we did. But
yeah, it was a lot, as they say.
It's yours, your floor, Michael.
You were in it for years.
What's that?
Yes, we were in it for
yeah.
well over a decade, to be honest, about the time. But Peggy was the one who called me on the phone in December of 1991 to tell me about the problems in New York. And I think you were on Mayor Dinkins' committee. There was Senator Patterson's committee, and community met every 2 weeks. And I think between those committees and the National, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, they had somehow pointed to me, and I was happy to have received your call, and was immediately alarming because you mentioned some of how I think you said something about, can you determine race from measurements of the hip? And I immediately thought, no, whoever you're
Yes,
listening to
that's
are the
right,
wrong
Michael.
people. These are the wrong people. And they did, and so you asked if I would assess the site and the circumstances and the researchers and research. And I came up for 10 days and worked on the site and did find a number of problems. And essentially the low.
But wait a minute, Michael, you have to add what stood out. Michael, what stood out for you though was coming before you started working on the project. You were the one archaeologist that showed up at a community meeting. I don't know whether you came up specifically for that meeting, but it was in GSA's office, and you came to that meeting, and it was, for me, I remember people viewing it as activism, you know, and commitment by showing up at this community meeting at GSA's office. One of the first times I might have met
think that
you.
was, yes, those were the bi-weekly meetings, and I came up at a time when I could attend one. Throughout the early parts, as throughout in the years of the project, we interacted directly with community representatives as well as with the GSA, the government agency that was building the building. And it was clear to me by the time that, within the few days of working on the site, that there were some problems of competency, and also sort of the, white fragility aspects of, perceptions that were based on, racist notions were coming, pouring out of the pores of the people, the archaeologists working on site and the GSA. So, but I had a lab at Howard, well-developed lab. We had just gotten NSF money for the Cobb collection. I had worked with Native Americans and others in the World Archaeological Congress, and we were very concerned that descendants have informed consent. And we were seeing things shift as Native Americans now took control of their ancestral remains with the NAGPRA law of 1990. Me and some of my colleagues, Black colleagues especially, were expecting our folks to move then to the next objectified other, which would be our people, without competent study of the culture and history to go with the biology. And I just finished with Leslie Rankin-Hill, what was then the largest African-American skeletal population from Philadelphia, the first African Baptist church, 140 individuals at the Smithsonian. And I therefore had students who had trained. So we were kind of ready to take control of our heritage through archaeology, bioarchaeology. And what I said at that community meeting was that we're available if there's any interest in us as researchers, if they want research at all, we'd love to talk to them about it.
And that was probably, it was consistent. What Michael did was consistent with what was needed throughout the life of the project, because my early dealings was working in the mayor's office of construction. I was able to sit in on a federal project. It was actually federal, it was city land that had been, given to the federal government. And so I was able to sit at the table with a federal agency that was void of, professionals in a variety of fields that this project should have had. And over time, I would say that the early work that I did before I started running the national design competition was really to advise and push the envelope about getting folks on board with the project that would offer a different lens, than what the project was typically sort of going, whether it was through architecture and design, if there was going to be a memorial, or handling of remains, who's doing that? How does the community, or how do we want to see memorialization happen? All of those things. But that conversation, those initial conversations, in trying to help reshape a project that, was being treated as business as usual. I mean, there were and lots of controversial stuff along the way. And that is to say, I mean, one of my earliest recollections was going to the site after, when they were in, the archaeologists were in the process of doing test pits. I don't know if I'm using the right term, but test pits to see if there in fact were any intact burials. And it was brought to my attention, because I worked in the mayor's office, that there was a gag order issued by the federal government. And as I went on a small tour with some city folks, I remember a woman, I was the only person of color in the group. We stood at the construction site, and an archaeologist came to the gate, and some questions were asked. And a woman asked, hey, we understand this might be a slave cemetery. Is that, can you tell that these people are Black, or what? How do we know? And of course, he responded in a way that was just dismissive, that almost that there was even, the likelihood of a cemetery or these enslaved Africans. We can't tell. And I was distraught and disturbed by his response, which attempted to erase and diminish the potential significance that this site had. And I had lost my father maybe a couple of years before, and my father was a civil rights attorney representing King during the Albany movement in Albany, Georgia. And I thought, his work, the work of so many other people who were there resisting the apartheid that was happening in Southwest Georgia, and imagine that this guy, on the word of the federal government, was attempting to erase the lives, the work, the sacrifices that were made. I was transmitting this onto people that I knew who were no longer with us. And I just felt very strongly that, that can't happen. That's what's been happening. Our narrative has been, consistently and systematically erased. And so that was my commitment.
Let me ask you this, since we're kind of touching on this. I'm going to skip over one question that I have specific to Michael right now, and I'm going to go to my next question, which is really around the issues related to preservation of sacred spaces. Not just this one, but any sacred spaces. I mean, you worked on A Story of Bones, and we talk about white fragility, we talk about the erasure of our history. And Michael, you kind of touched that there were some other issues. I don't know if it was all anthropological issues that were going on with this one particular burial ground project. But what are some of those issues related to the preservation of these sacred spaces? I mean, is it just that people don't want to find out? They don't want us to uncover and discuss and bring to light? Or is it more than that? Is it just the fact that they just don't know? And that's where you come into play, right? That's why, Peggy, you reached out to Michael and said something doesn't look quite right here, and I have some questions for you. Talk to me about those issues that are related to that.
Well, let me just say something anthropological about the significance of cemeteries and mortuary ritual. This is the marker of humanity that emerged with our species throughout the evolution of human beings. There were points at which species that stood erect, walked on two legs, used tools, made fire, shared food. But when you get to Homo sapiens, what marks them is the burial of the dead. No other species does that. We all do it. It's not about any particular religion. It's about all religions and none. It is the symbol, and it's the first archaeologically recorded symbolic behavior. It is the symbol of being a human being, of what I think of as dignity. That's something we as humans understand. So if you look at the archaeological record of the African burial ground, you will see that while these Africans were being treated as property, which they knew themselves not to be, struggled with that conflict, for hundreds of years, ultimately, they buried their dead carefully, had trouble working with the system around them to be able to do that, but did, put what little they had as offerings into the graves. At the same time, the English and Dutch pottery factory next door and the tannery next door threw trash on the cemetery, used it as a dump. So this is in the late 18th century, the contestation of their humanity and their dignity. This is not very different from what happened in the late 20th century. And there, where the GSA is basically a development corporation, put its interest in development first and disregarded the dignity of African Americans. And so why did all those people surround that site, all those African Americans and people of the African diaspora, with prayer vigils and protests for months? They were human beings. They had no choice, essentially, but to defend their dignity. I think the larger problem I see with their descendant communities coming up over the last 30 years everywhere, African Americans mainly, and they're defending cemeteries. They're defending their dignity. And usually the problem is development of some sort. So it is, sort of greedy developers who feel they can dismiss Black people, Black people's graves, out of their, the ignorance and the racism of our society. And so what we did was help our community oppose that and offer not only the preservation of the cemetery, which was most keen on the minds of African Americans in New York and their allies in the 90s, but if they would want to restore the history, which was also not written about, in the 18th century, European chroniclers wrote about property, not human beings. And so we asked for the questions that the community wanted, to incorporate those into our research design. And as a result of a long struggle and, the work of 30 PhDs and 200 students and 9 laboratories and universities, I think we have, our 2,500 page reports are the most sophisticated bioarchaeology that's been done. But most importantly, and part of that sophistication is that it follows the questions that African American descendants had about our history that were so dear and rare in archives.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michael. There are a number of challenges. When you talk about historic preservation, you're talking about resources being available to the community. You're talking about issues around people galvanizing or being able to pull together in a community. Some communities are smaller than other communities. Sometimes it's tougher to get folks together. Some people believe that just one article appeared in the New York Times and everybody came out and marched. That didn't happen. It really took folks, I was included, behind the scenes, bending the ear of elected officials and saying, you've got to get behind this and you've got to get your constituents out. Taking information that was not meant to be public and giving it to them anyway, so that they had the resources to galvanize the community and get the attention. It's New York City, and there are a number of cities like that, but certainly in New York City, it's hard to get anybody's attention. I don't care who you are. The other challenge, aside from resources, is it's always systems of power, whether it's a developer, whether it's a city. you know, communities, marginalized communities are always faced with systems of power. And unless they have elected officials or certain folks who can change that, some of the sites that I've worked on outside of Atlanta, Georgia, Noonan, Georgia, we marched to downtown Noonan. W.E. Du Bois wrote about Sam Hose, who was lynched in Noonan, Georgia. All right. And we stood under the Confederate soldier because they were developing a skate park, a multi-million-dollar skate park as a part or within the confines of a Black cemetery. And so these are the challenges. And oftentimes these developers have had the properties and they've developed them for over years, and they're in the hands of those who don't understand. There is still an outstanding debt to reparative justice that's owed on that site because it is a site of remembrance. And just something else that I might add, Michael inspired me because what he just said about we as humans and what makes us human is how and that we bury our dead. And it's something that I share with people because people say, will ask me, why are these burial grounds so important? And I say that I learned from Michael because of that point. It made me to think that if that is what defines us as human, I say to people, imagine a society where a people are considered or deemed inhuman, that there is no right that a white man need respect, that it's the laws on the books. And on the occasion that they are given or permitted to bury their dead, and in, you know, a brother, sister, mother, father, and that they sing over the dead, or they put an object, or they do something, pour libation. Imagine what they would be doing was, in fact, reclaiming the humanity of a loved one. But not only that, the way I see it, is that they would be engaging in a revolutionary act of remembrance. And in this country, we preserve battlegrounds, revolutionary battlegrounds. And so I see those sites as battlegrounds because if you have a community engaging in those acts, they are in fact really engaging in an act of rebellion and it's a comment on our society that said that you were inhuman.
Yeah, thank you for that.
May I follow up with the idea that, you know, one of in New York in the 18th century, it became illegal for Africans to bury their dead at night. And in Virginia, slaveholders had, in the late 17th century, legally gained control of the right of whether the enslaved could have funerals or not, which is a lot of leverage to have on people. And their concern was, in both cases, organizing rebellions during the night at funerals. These are powerful places with, you know, powerful moment, and as powerful a moment as we saw in New York over those years of the African burial ground.
Yeah,
you know, people care.
that's right.
And it's about the thinking of, you know, we brought out the idea of Sankofa into the public discussion for the first time. We brought out the idea of descendant communities into public for the first time. And you know, it is it was important for all of us to be able to, you know, I sometimes call us, I play as the great Montague Cobb did with species names as a way of sending, you know, discussing something. And I sometimes think of us as Homo reminiscens, the memorializer. Why is that not our name? That's how we began. We, you know, memory is important to human beings. And with Sankofa, you know, we honored the idea that we should look to the past if we're to understand the present and the future. And there are people walking around and said, oh, forget about the past. Let's just start now. There are people in GSA would say that. And since I heard somebody say that, I knew they were trying to get away with something. You know, now we've got Ron DeSantis, folks in Florida, right? And Virginia, and spreading, who are saying our children cannot be taught about the past. It might make white people, though they say in his Stop Woke Act, people, but he's
Right.
erasing, but it's white people,
Right.
uncomfortable. There are a lot of uncomfortable people and things in the world.
Yeah.
And that need to be changed. That's so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it's all in that fight of memory. It's so important.
Well, Michael, I'm gonna go to you again with another question. I want to understand what the term descendant community means. And I mean, to even be more specific, what does it mean culturally? What does it mean socially, politically, legally? Tell me what that means to you.
Well, I don't know if I'll try and cover all that, but
And you got like 2 minutes to do it, right?
Okay.
No, I'm just teasing. Go ahead.
Well, and it's a term we coined at the African Burial Ground to represent the empowerment that the Black community had already assumed as stewards of their ancestors. So I was looking for, and I looked in the National Historic Preservation Act for some language and here and there. And descendant community is either in the National Historic Preservation Act or like it. And what it represents is are the members of the social group to which the members of the descendants of the social group to which the ancestors belong. It is a group that therefore has sort of natural rights of stewardship, and they should care. That's another part of the definition. So these are those who stand up for the dignity of their ancestors, initially from the African burial ground. So it's about a cemetery, and they should have, rights as stewards of that to determine ultimately, as Native Americans have in their Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the rights to determine the disposition of the dead. Now, what that allowed us to do is engage in informed consent, which is a basic ethical principle. So we did no research that hadn't been vetted, discussed by the descendant community as they formed in New York, and ultimately approved by them, understanding that we would also return the remains, reinter them for sacred space. And this was really the second such reburial. The other was at the Smithsonian, working with Larry Angel and Leslie Rankin-Hill. I mentioned that project we had just done before. And so, but here we also added the idea of the democratization of knowledge, that our project would be informed by the questions of the descendant community, which helped them decide to approve it. And indeed, the range of our questions was really more sophisticated than what my colleagues and I were able to come up with, talking just to each other. And therefore, also, it was a project of and by the community. So, the descendant community gave us a great deal of support. And we had $6 million, I think, because not only was it backed by the community, but the questions were of value to someone other than just anthropologists. So there are two things. The National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2018 has now came to use the concept of a descendant community, pretty much the same as with the African burial ground. I worked with them, 50 scholars and culture workers and descendants worked with them. And now it goes beyond advisement on or determining the disposition of cemeteries. It is about creating structural parity with descendants of the enslaved at historic sites and museums. So the National Trust believes descendants should have half the control of places like James Madison's Montpelier, where they have established now structural parity. So half of that 2,600-acre presidential site is controlled, it is half controlled. The half of the board are descendants. And then finally, I'm co-chair of the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains that the American Anthropological Association has put together since we've really, recent fiasco in Philadelphia a few years ago demonstrated that our professional ethics are not tight enough, our standards are not high enough. And so we've gone around the world talking to indigenous people. Deborah Thomas at Penn and our colleagues about what they think of the ethics of, I think it was Peggy who said something about what if human remains were not taken as dignified. Well, museums do that all the time. Objectified. My colleagues do that all the time. But we found that the African burial ground is really the only case we could give them where informed consent had been used. Where the science went with the dignity of community control, not of the answers to the questions. That's empirical science, but the questions themselves.
And I was going to say that the New York African Burial Ground and how it was handled, whether it was through Dr. Cheryl Wilson, Dr. Blakey and the team, and even the work that I was doing with memorialization, and throughout the process, even before we even got that far, we're talking about the Federal Steering Committee. We had monthly meetings when I was the executive director in Harlem at the Schomburg Center. The entire community was invited. It was open. We would have a meeting, and then we had an open mic, and every month, and we had transcripts of everything that everybody said. Community members could come in and voice their opinions, whether it was about design, memorial, the science, all of it. And this project continues to really set the bar, at least for new projects where communities are galvanizing and trying to protect their sites. And I know that Michael gets people reaching out to him. I get people reaching out to me from all over the world, and Michael does too, because when they look to the African burial ground, they're looking to the people who were there in the trenches, trying to make sure that the community voices were a part of that. And it certainly was there as a part of the memorial design and the interpretive center and how the building was meant to be used, the access to the building, the artwork in the building, all of that was certainly influenced and driven by the community and their voices.
All right, so we've got about 3 more minutes. I want to try to squeeze in one more question before we kind of switch gears and go to the Q&A, because their questions are coming in and people want to talk to you all. But before we do that, I just want to ask a question like, why is it so important now in present day to understand preserving those sacred spaces? I mean, we know we talked about DeSantis and what's going on in Florida. We know even in Georgia, where I live, I see where they are erasing our history, right? Just from changing, like what I've noticed is like changing the word slaves to workers, little things over time is erasing our history. So tell me, why is it so important in present day to understand why we need to preserve this?
Certainly in my work, whenever I get people reaching out to me, and there's small and large projects, I'm working on a project in Manhattan, another Manhattan project, Northern Manhattan. It's a Dutch site from the 1700s. And we discovered that some of the remains that were moved, we don't know what happened to most of them, but 5 of the skulls have ended up in the Museum of Natural History. So now we're working on a memorial. I'm advising the developer. Why we need this, and then I'm actually speaking to you from St. Eustatius down in the Dutch Caribbean, where there's the whole island has about 76 to 79 old plantations, and we're finding that many of these enslaved African population, they're buried on all these various plantations, what were former plantations. There are other sites in the States. There's Staten Island. There's a cemetery that was built over by a shopping center. So why is it important? it's important because we're talking about repair. It has always been important. We're talking about reparations, or the act of repair, and using memory as a way of doing that. We're talking about narrative justice. We're talking about being able to reclaim our story and to be able to tell it in the way that we know it should be told, to really tap into the truth of who we are and who we are in the larger scope. That's the short version that I can contribute to that.
I can't add anything except to maybe elaborate it a little with something that I heard Sharon Pratt Kelly, who had been mayor of Washington, D.C., say at Montpelier last year. She has come to realize that today history is the new politics.
Yes.
To emphasize what you're saying. You know, this has always been a 500-year wrestling match sometimes, dance, but the man said, right, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. So
justice, right. That's right. That's right.
So, wow, lots of conversation, lots of questions coming in. So I'm getting ready to toss to the Q&A. For those who have not put in their questions and have questions to ask our panel, go ahead and use the Q&A section in Zoom. But I'm going to go ahead and open that up and start asking you all some questions. All right, the first question comes from Holly Fulton. The question is there a kind of, if you will, connection of burial grounds across the country to people can find information on burial grounds similar to the one in Manhattan and other parts of the United States? So can they find information about that?
Well, there have been a couple of starts. Yeah, a couple of starts. I'm not sure how reliable those projects have come to be, folks who tried it. But there's recently a new bill in Congress that was passed that establishes, through the Park Service and the National Trust, such a network of recording cemeteries. So we will see shortly, I think, information about cemeteries everywhere.
Right, as people begin to test it and to use it and reach out on various projects. And so we need a little bit of time, but yeah.
Yeah, something like the African American Burial Grounds Act, but I'm not remembering exactly. Something like that.
Okay. And we have a question from an anonymous attendee. When the federal or national government is not directly involved, what are the challenges, in particular on private property? Are the challenges different? And if so, how? That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The challenges are greater.
Yeah. The challenges are definitely greater. Yeah. And there's a site in New Jersey, in Bergen County, which was one of the big, huge slaveholding counties in New Jersey, directly across from Manhattan. And there was a house that, supposedly was a house for enslaved Africans, a small house. And of course, somebody bought the property. Some community members tried to save it, but they tossed it. It takes, unfortunately, private property, it takes a conscience. It takes somebody with a conscience, or a group with a conscience.
You get a lot of no's and like serious no, leave me alone, don't talk to me type, or do you feel like they've invested
money? Yeah, they've invested money in a site, and they don't have the same interests as the community.
Yeah.
And
All right, we have a question from Viola Hayhurst. Living in the New England area, could you compare and contrast your experience in New York with that of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in honoring its dead of African descent?
I don't know what to compare it to. So if I knew a little bit more about the Portsmouth, I mean, I'm wondering what challenges they faced, or if there were any challenges. I don't know a lot about the project, and void of that, I can't compare.
Yeah. All right, we have a question from Robert Cataliotti. Were there artifacts found in the burial sites? If so, what do they tell us about the lives of these African people who live in New York? That's a really good
All right.
question.
Yes, there were, yeah, hundreds of thousands. But, you know, archaeological artifacts means nails and fragments of glass and every little thing. I would recommend that whoever has a chance should look to our volumes. We have 3 volumes, one on history, one on archaeological volume is in 3 parts. It's very extensive, and a 2-part volume on the skeletal biology. And we were always in communication with each other. It's a big multidisciplinary project, but we broke down the findings in those ways. Warren Perry at Central Connecticut University and Gene Housen, a contract archaeologist, were our key people in the archaeological side of things and the cultural side of archaeology. And they did a wonderful job with their many colleagues. So you go to the U.S. National Monument site, the National Park Service African Burial Ground site, and the website, and look for our 2009 volumes under my name, Edna Medford in history, and those archaeologists. And they are supposed to provide you with the hard copy if you call the monument. So press them for that too, but you can get it online. It's all there.
And Michelle, I wanted to add something. That's a good question. What people don't realize, I had the occasion to be invited to one of the scientific retreats led by Dr. Blakey years ago. And I was the one non-scientific person there, and I was permitted to attend. All of the other big brain people. I'm the, you know, the creative one, but they had all of the science, and I sat through all of their presentations, the findings, you know, all of the things that they were looking at, whether they were artifacts, whether they were DNA, whether they were, you know, any of that. And I was asked to present, and I know that I was hearing that there were some people who was like, well, why is she here? What, you know, what's she going to bring to the table? And what I explained, and I don't remember what my PowerPoint looked like or my presentation looked like, but I was explaining that everything that I was learning, I would be taking back as someone who was running the memorialization and the design competition, that the work and the things that they were finding, their findings, I needed to be able to help translate to design professionals who would be inspired by their findings, so that when it came time to design a memorial, how we were going to take up space in New York City and be able to tell this story, that their work and their findings and all of the artifacts would help to create that, would help shape what that was. And that's that people, you know, I try and get people to understand that too helps shape how we take up space and how we want to show up in the landscape with our story, with our history.
Yeah, we were truly interdisciplinary. And if you look at the Rodney Leon monument itself, etched into it are persons' names and sexes, and not names, I'm sorry, sexes and ages. That's all we know.
Yeah.
That identify the range of these people who, you know, the biology and the archaeology says were very poor, struggled, worked increasingly hard, men and women. We can show that. And some of it gets directly written into the monument. It's all part of how we understand our memorialization of that space, whether, you know, it's built or discussed in the visitor center.
All right, we've got a ton of questions still coming in. So let's go to the next question. This is from another anonymous attendee. How would you propose a descendant create a tombstone without lavish works, but ancestral memory and honor and respect? For example, stones, cowrie shells, etc., and nameplates. So how would you propose a descendant to create a tombstone?
You know, I spend a lot of time, and more recently in the work that I do, I work with communities talking about memorialization and what does that mean? And what this individual should know is that there's no one right way. You can do all kinds of representational work to honor someone, but memorialization can show up in a lot of different ways. And one of the exercises that I've done, and I was working with a group and we were sort of mapping out various parts of a toolkit for community. And I was working on a piece about memorialization. And one of the things that I encourage communities to do is to really take a site and think about why, or maybe it's a site or an individual, whomever, why that individual, why that site is important to them, and write everything down. Do a whole total brain dump, right? Everything. And then go back and look at that and distill from that the most important things that you feel that you need to take away, that have a golden thread that's going to last for generations, that's going to leave you with the message that you think is most important. And that is to say, by example, you know, the story of Romeo and Juliet has been told many ways, many times, but the story is the same. Everybody knows how it's going to end and what the storyline is. It happens in Greek mythology. It happens in a whole lot of other stories, and it'll be told in a lot of different ways, but we ultimately know what the moral of the story is. And I guess I try and encourage communities to get to, and I would say to this individual, get to what is most important and then interpret it in a way. You can interpret that in any way. You don't have to do the shells, their meaning. You know, I'd say get some books, Flash of the Spirit, and some other books that help you if you know, African symbolism is important to you. But what's most important is to really define what it is that is the most powerful thing about this memorial, what it's intended to do for you and whoever else visits it.
All right, thanks, Peggy. Okay, we've got maybe about 3 or 4 minutes max, and still a lot of questions. So we're going to try to get some answers out really quick, okay? The next one is from Cheryl Brown. Is there any type of project or organization to research who the buried are and contact their ancestors to them?
I don't want to be flippant. Skip Gates. Go on his show. No, I don't know. I mean, a lot of that, you know, I would say,
I mean,
well,
you know,
no. I think that I don't know the straight path, but I do know that there are with different municipalities, there are people who volunteer research to help. Yeah. If you're tracing someone, you know, that may be a resource. They can help you, you know, if there's a particular site or, you know, group. I don't know, Michael, do you know anybody else or any other way?
Well, I think there are some different sites that are working on that. Montpelier is working on creating a database. We're working with folks in Shenandoah who are also doing that, but only at the very local level. So I need to know where and you're talking about. Those efforts are beginning.
Right. But if it is local, I do know that certain historical societies or certain cities or townships have people who are willing, if you call your local archives or information office, you know, I don't know, city archives, they sometimes know the names of people who will do research for you for either a fee or for free, you know.
Genealogists in the local African American historical societies.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
All right, one more question I think we can take. Is there any way to determine the race of an individual from the remains of the deceased, especially when they were done prior to Reconstruction, when Blacks were buried alongside others?
So there is a huge amount of overlap between members of so-called races. We're really ethnic groups with ancestry coming from a similar region, each of us, and intermarriage between us all. But that means that on average, you know, there are some characteristics. Maybe if it's the skeleton, it's the width of the nose, it's some of the contours of the face, and really it's only the skull that's going to tell you much of anything about whether if you were alive in this society, you would be considered Black or white or Asian. This is really what we're looking at. DNA research is fancier, but it's got the same problem. A lot of overlap between people. So
that was actually one of the questions. There's a question came that said, what are the ethical considerations to bear in mind when drawing on DNA databases and extracting DNA from ancestral remains and potentially connecting to descendant communities and individuals? So
we are working on the Commission for the Ethical Treatment of Human Remains, and we'll have a final report in May. We just put out an interim report on the ethics of that. And informed consent is going to be important. I would suggest personally, don't give up your DNA unless you know exactly what it's going to be used for, and then get it back. Do not give it up permanently to anyone. There are some I know recently on the Catoctin Furnace site, David Reich and Doug Owsley at the Smithsonian, Reich at Harvard and Owsley at the Smithsonian, where it seemed to me made it appear that they could link descendants, specific individuals, to individuals whose skeletons they had at the Smithsonian. They cannot do that.
Yeah.
It's not possible. Maybe that's but they begin to collect a lot of data for various uses, maybe to discover that too, but maybe they won't. You know, this is not the kind of science, genetics or human biology that is, you know, absolute cut and dry. So be very careful with your samples and be skeptical, because often geneticists promise a lot more than they can deliver. They've been doing that since the eugenics movement, okay?
Yeah. Well, thank you. We are literally out of time and we did not get to all the questions. They have been coming in, but thank you so much, Peggy and Michael.
Thank you.
This has been a really incredible session. Time, as I think I told you all before we even started, time was going to fly. And as you saw, time flew when we were having these conversations. I appreciate the time that you've given us to be able to discuss deeply into this topic. Really quick, 30 seconds, because we are running out of time. Any parting thoughts before we wrap this up?
You know, I just encourage, I just encourage, I assume that the people who have tuned in to this program are interested in preservation. They're interested in protecting sites like the ones that Michael and I work on. And I would just encourage you to keep going, no matter whether you feel that there's a roadblock, keep going. And if you just Google, if you want to talk to me, write me, call me, whatever. I'm out there. But just to keep going, because we need your help. We need you to do this work, this memory work.
All right, Michael.
And please read our volumes. They're online at the National Park Service, National Monument Site, African Burial Ground Site. Pick them up, read them, please. Well, we wrote them. They're somewhat technical, but we wrote them with the idea that we wanted anybody, you know, with a decent education to be able to read them.
Yeah.
And go to the Visitor Center.
Yes.
And if you haven't gone to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the short name I use is Our Museum on the mall. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. Agreed.
Thank you. All right. In the article, Silencing the Past, Michelle Rolfe-Tuyo writes, quote, "We have a personal relationship with sacred spaces. The past does not exist independently from the present. unquote. And conversely, the present doesn't exist independently from the past. So we appreciate the work that both of you all are doing to preserve and protect our sacred spaces. So thank you both for your time. We also thank everyone that's joined us today. I truly hope you enjoyed this session. I know I learned quite a bit today. Thank you. I also want to thank Ann Cobb, Ann Chen, Nick Huster, the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Fort Markers Project Board, and thanks again to all who have made this program happen. Really quickly, there are a few things that I want to mention before we end. If you do have questions that we didn't get to or any other questions that come up, please contact the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Fort Markers Project at middlepassagemarkers@gmail.com. Also, Peggy said, look for her. Michael, I'm sure that may be the same for you. I'm putting you out there, but feel free to reach out if you have questions. In order for the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Fort Markers Project to continue this level of programming, we do need your support, not only financially, but also with your involvement and appreciation of the significance of this work that we're doing. So to support the research, promotion, and sharing of the history of our ancestors, there are some ways to donate. You can donate through PayPal or GiveButter. The links to both are on the screen and on the website middlepassageproject.org. You can mail your donation to Middle Passage Ceremonies and Fort Markers Project, P.O. Box 3071, Jacksonville, Florida, and the zip code is 32206. And we also now have a Venmo account that you can donate directly to the organization, and that information is also on the screen. My name is Michelle Dingle, and I hope you will join us next week on Saturday, February 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This will be the last in our 2024 Black History Month series, and it will be a live conversation on the topic of preservation, culture, and commemoration.